Hi. I'm just thinking about thoughts and how they're basically what energizes the world. They're the drivers that force the world to orbit, not gravitational pull. It's thoughts. Can you prove differently? Not if you consider solipsism or other theories of epistemology. How do we know that the reality we perceive is, well, real? The power of the mind is astonishing. We're able to suspend our disbelief, to fabricate completely new concepts, to accept a lie and write it as truth. That's essentially what you're doing when you're writing a fiction book. It's not real. But are your words not authentic if they come from your head onto paper? Or is that what turns the real into the false? The act of taking it from the body, the soul. Wouldn't the reverse also work then? Consuming something into you or me? Are the words in books real then because you're consuming them? Do they feel real to you as you read them? If you pick a word from a page, close your eyes and say them aloud. Can you taste them? Is it sweet, succulent, bitter? Is it gritty or creamy? And after they've left your tongue, can you still taste them now that they're no longer within you? Does that mean they were real or fake the entire time? Words are power, and your thoughts are their source of origin. Perhaps then the most powerful thing you could ever wield. Writing a book is an execution of that power. What do you want to accomplish with it? In this video, we'll be talking about your thoughts and how you can weed them out onto paper. We'll talk about the actual process of preparing your story before you begin, laying the groundwork through brain dumping techniques, and then starting a foundation for you to build upon. If you missed part 1, we talked about the mental preparation that goes into starting a book. We talked about some common roadblocks that might be causing you to procrastinate. So if that interests you, definitely check that out first. I've linked it in the description below. So grab a notebook, a pen, or a blank document, and let's get started. Before I start this video, don't mind the mess in the back. I'm still setting up this space, so it's kind of chaos right now. Let's talk about how to start writing a book, beginning with idea collection, because successful novel planning actually begins way before the first chapter. It all starts with all those tasty thoughts swirling around inside your brain, and we've got to dump it out. But first we have to listen, and that means allowing yourself to get swept up into that whirlwind. The best way to listen to yourself is to remove yourself from reality. Find a place away from distraction or noise where you can go sit and stare at a wall, close your eyes, just allow yourself to be bored. This is key because our minds hate boredom. We need to think about something. And if you take your brain out of a situation where it can't think about real life issues, your daily schedule, your responsibility, it will start to think about other things. Your mind will start fabricating scenes, people, dialogue, other worlds, anything, because its purpose is to think. It's a thought generator. And this is how you enter the daydreaming state. Now, daydreaming is a delicate state to get into because it's very easy to get distracted and at the beginning. But if you let yourself get lulled in, you enter a kind of flow state that's harder to pull yourself out of. It's kind of like reading a book. At first, you're just staring at text on a page, but slowly the words become visualizations in your mind, and instead of reading text, it's now a movie playing inside of your head. Daydreaming is the same thing. You're just cutting out the middleman. Now, if you're trying to daydream, but you find yourself still thinking about real life, that's okay. Allow yourself to think about it, but don't let yourself get lost in it. Think of it like productive meditation, but you're letting go of your real world thoughts and accepting the rest. Another way you can clear out your head and make room for daydreaming is by brain dumping. Brain dumping is a stream of conscious style of writing that many people use to clear out their head and focus. Stream of conscious meaning that you write without structure or guided prompts. It's just completely the first things that come to your mind, you write it down. I like to keep a morning journal in which I write completely stream of conscious, and this helps me get rid of all of the thought trash left over from yesterday, the night before, whatever I dreamt. And this is where I write all my inundating real world thoughts. So this is one way that you can help yourself daydreaming, and it's also a really good way to process any anxiety or frustrations or negative thoughts that you might be feeling. There's a lot of scientific research on the benefits of journaling, which I highly suggest you look into if you're interested. Now, as writers, this technique is great for logging ideas that could potentially be useful in your story or to use as material for something else. You just write down anything and everything related to the story you want to tell, all your ideas, your thoughts, even if you're writing about how much your protagonist hates ketchup for some reason. So once you've entered a daydream state that's conducive to storytelling, open your notebook or a blank document on your laptop and just write everything down. Every fragment that could be part of a story, like a toolkit. Not everything will make it into the final draft, but having these elements documented gives you materials to work with as you move forward. And they'll also help you build up the underwater mass of your narrative iceberg. The narrative iceberg is a theory by Ernest Hemingway that describes the structure of a good story being akin to an iceberg. The details that make it into your book comprise the above water part that you actually see. But as you know, icebergs have huge underwater masses that can be twice or triple the size of what you see on the surface. So Hemingway proposed that a good book will have an underwater mass that's much larger than its surface. And this mass is all the information that doesn't make it into your book. This can be intricate world building details, character backstory that isn't relevant to the plot but is relevant to the character's motivations, fears, or overall development. Or it can be any information that as a whole creates the stabilizing foundation that keeps your story above water. Stream of conscious writing or brain dumping is great for this because it helps you think of all the little details that might not make it into your book but form the context and environment that your characters journey within. So everything that you write down during this process is potential material for this. Also, don't worry about organization yet. The key is to separate the creation phase from the organization phase. When you're brain dumping, don't worry about where things fit, just get them out onto paper. Afterward is when you can organize these elements into a coherent structure. This is a stage where you put your inner editor on mute. Perfection does not exist here. Your goal is quantity over quality because the more raw material you have, the more options you'll have to work with once you begin actually writing the story. So what are some things you want to think about while brain dumping? Your core story concept. This is the central idea, theme, or message that your story and plot revolves around. Your key characters. These are the most prominent characters in your book who drive the plot forward. Without them, you wouldn't have a story. Potential plot points. These are any events or scenes in your story, positive or negative, that could impact your characters and their goals. This could involve characters making plot-changing choices or external events like environmental disasters, or maybe a five-headed dragon with a missing head appears and suddenly eats your protagonist, who is then subsumed into the missing fifth head. Setting details. This would be any significant or notable places in your story. As a fantasy writer, I like to let my imagination run a little wild here. And thematic elements. These are underlying ideas, messages, or concepts that are explored in your story through the plot, characters, and conflicts. So, for example, love versus duty, good and evil, identity and belonging, redemption, the price of power, etc., etc. These elements shape how your story unfolds and what deeper meaning your readers take away. So when you're keeping these things in mind, just write whatever comes to your head. Even if it's like little bits of dialogue or their mannerisms or quirks or what their hair looks like. For the characters. For the plot, it can be something similar. You can maybe even write about the setting. Just anything that will be relevant to your story. Again, try to shut down your inner editor or critic here. But one side effect that you will hopefully get from this exercise is getting excited about your story. You're building up all the little elements. There are no rules that you need to follow, no specific outline if you don't have one yet. Anything and everything is possible at this stage. Now that you've jumped your day away, let's talk about your narrative spark. This is that initial spark of an idea that has the potential to grow into a full narrative. It could be a what-if scenario, a character that pops into your head, or a scene that plays out in your imagination. For me, music is what drives my inspiration. When I write, I listen to orchestral or epic trailer music, basically instrumental music without lyrics. This helps me get into a daydreaming state, and usually I'm hit with a single scene that suddenly plays out in my head and I can't let go of it. It attaches itself to my brain and encompasses my thoughts until I just need to start writing it out. And this is my narrative spark. Now, I touched on this in part 1, but it's very likely that you'll have multiple narrative sparks at a given time. And this is where you can encounter the idea overwhelm roadblock, where you have so many competing ideas that you don't know where to start or how to even pick one. In that first video, I went over things you can do to help you decide on an idea, and there are also cheat sheets for you to screenshot, so watch that if you're interested. So you pick a spark, ideally the one you're most interested about, and we're gonna start building the campfire to let it grow into a flame. In other words, we're going to build the foundation. Before we start though, let's talk about pantsers and plotters. If you don't know, pantsers are writers who prefer to write their book in a fully or almost fully stream of conscious style. They have an idea, they start writing, and the story uncovers itself as they write. Maybe they'll have a basic outline to follow, but for the most part, they start from chapter 1, finish in the last chapter in one go. Not actually one go, that would be crazy. Plotters are writers who prefer to create an outline of the story that they can follow as they write. And they'll typically write within the boundaries of this outline, with the exception of a character making a decision that sways from the outline and the writer decides to just roll with it. The majority of writers I've spoken with prefer to utilize a blend of both methods. And even though I'm a plotter through and through, I think that incorporating both methods in your process is the ideal mix of structure and spontaneity. So since we're moving on to the more outline-esque sections of this video, the pantsers watching might be wondering how it applies to them, but in reality, even pantsers can't just start from a blank page and expect to easily reach the last chapter without multiple revisions. This is especially so for longer books, especially fantasy books, or books that have a lot of in-depth world building to it. All good writers, pantsers and plotters alike, need to establish a foundation or framework to work within. The amount of depth that goes into this framework is what separates the pantsers from the plotters. So some of these next sections might not interest you or apply to you depending on your preferred level of outlining, but all writers need to understand the core of their story and the parts of their story that aren't easily affected by the characters, such as setting. So we're going to develop your narrative spark using the following questions. 1. Who is your protagonist, really? Your protagonist is the driving force of your story. They're the ones whose choices and actions consistently and directly push the plot forward, whose desires create conflict, and whose growth forms the emotional core of your novel. But protagonists are like any other living organism. They have flaws. Perfect characters are flat, dull, boring, and unrealistic. So your protagonist and all the characters who impact your plot should mess up. They should make bad decisions out of pure emotion and have beliefs that get challenged, whether by the characters in the story or by the readers. They should be stubborn or impulsive or afraid. These flaws create relatable internal conflict with external narrative impact, and they act as foundations for your protagonist to grow and develop, which builds your character arc. Now, think about what is it your protagonist wants, what or who is stopping them, and what are they willing to do to get it. Let's take our 5-headed monster idea, for example. The protagonist is a scholar who is trying to find her long-lost twin within an abandoned tower that holds multiple realities and is being chased by a 5-headed dragon with a missing head. She prefers logical, academic approaches and is also very stubborn. She also hates ketchup. In this moment, the 4-headed dragon has found her, and she must choose between escaping through the closest portal that leads to a dimension where everything is made of ketchup, or staying in the tower and facing the dragon. She hates ketchup so much that she chooses to stay in the tower and face the dragon and try to kill it using her smarts. This is the nuance that keeps your characters from feeling flat. She prides herself on her logic and intellect, but fear makes her act rashly. And because of this, she gets eaten by the dragon and becomes the 5th head. And the second point. What is the world in which your story takes place? Even if you're not writing fantasy or sci-fi, every story needs a vivid setting that invokes all your senses. I mention the senses because that's a surefire way to pull readers into your book so that they're not just reading text on a page, but they're inside the story itself. Your characters shouldn't just be seeing things. They should also be smelling wet moss spreading into the abandoned tower, or feeling the crisp damp of the air, or touching the gritty, cold stone stair rail. All these descriptors transform your setting into its own character that influences how your plot unfolds, except it's much more rigid than a character itself, and this can add stakes and challenges to your plot. Even if you're writing contemporary or literary fiction, you need to understand the rules and limitations of your world and society. What's possible? What isn't? What are the consequences of breaking societal norms? And then for fantasy and sci-fi writers, you want to probably define the rules of your magic and technology. But regardless of genre, you want to focus on the aspects of your world that directly impact your story. If your character never visits the Northern Kingdoms, you don't need to fully flesh out the political hierarchy there unless it's specifically relevant to the plot. It's not super important to fully develop your world in the first draft. Now, you might disagree with this, But for the first draft, and this is something I mentioned in the first video, the first draft just needs to exist. You just need to get it out on paper and get over the bumps that might be making you procrastinate. For the first draft, you want to build what matters to your plot and characters first, and then you can add in the little details later to form the underwater mass of your iceberg. So now that we've figured out some of the foundational elements of your story, let's pull it all together and create your high concept pitch. This is essentially a one-sentence summary that describes your main character, their primary goal, the main conflict, and what makes your story unique. Think of it like an elevator pitch. If you were in an elevator with a literary agent who asked you what your book is about, and you only have the length of the elevator ride to get them interested, what would you say? The reason you want to figure this out before you write is because it helps keep you grounded as you write so that you don't sway from the original concept. This is useful for both pantsers and plotters because plotters can use this to start their outline, and pantsers can just keep this pitch in mind while they're writing the story and still have the freedom to add or change how the characters get from beginning to end. So now that we've established your high concept pitch, let's figure out who your target reader is. You might not think this is important, but one of the most valuable writing tips I've learned is that knowing who your reader is shapes how your novel unfolds and how you write it. This isn't as important if you're pursuing traditional publishing because the publishing house will typically take care of this for you. But even if you're doing traditional publishing, you still have to do some marketing of your own. And especially so if you're self-publishing a book, you need to know who you're going to be publishing it for. If you're writing a spicy romantasy book, you're not targeting 5th graders, that's for sure. But contemporary romantasy has a varied readership and is usually defined by how spicy they like their books to be. So that's why it's important to understand who you're targeting. 12-year-old Alice might not be allowed to read your hot and heavy medieval romance exploring the concepts of lust to gain power and title, but 29-year-old Susan will eat that up and lick the plate clean. Knowing this will influence how you write your story, what characters you include, what scenes you write, and more importantly, how you market it later on. For example, my sci-fi fantasy novel that I'm working on right now has a romance subplot, but it's not the driving force of the story. It's action heavy, it explores darker themes, has superpowers and gods in it, and the main characters are male. So I'm expecting that my target audience will probably be in their mid-20s or older, possibly more male than female, because the main characters are male, enjoys DC and Marvel movies, likes RPG games, and probably has a more pessimistic outlook on life that drives them to escapism. So when you're constructing your book's ideal reader, some things you should think about are what age group are you writing for? What genres do they typically read? What expectations will they have when they open your book? And what interests might they have based on the information you've gathered already? This is important because it also directly impacts your first chapter. For example, if you're writing for teenage or young adult readers, you might want to open with a moment of conflict or tension that resonates with teen experiences. And the protagonist should deal with relatable issues like identity, belonging, first love, or family expectations while facing whatever larger conflict drives your plot. So there you go. Some tools to turn your story idea into something concrete. You've successfully dumped out your brain and picked out the good bits. In the next video, part 3, we're gonna talk about the actual writing of your first chapter, including my son. He's awake. And we'll talk about some opening techniques that you can try and some obstacles you should avoid. If you like this workbook that I used, that's my cheap printable 90-day novel launchpad planner that I made just for writers like you. I'll link it in the description. It'll take you to my Etsy shop where you can browse my other cheap workbooks. I'd love to hear what projects you're working on, so leave a comment and don't forget to like and subscribe. Until the next chapter.